Hi, everyone. Welcome to Off the Podium. I'm here in Seattle, and my guest is Principal Oboe of the Seattle Symphony, faculty member at the University of Washington, Mary Lynch. Welcome to Off the Podium.
Thank you so much, Tigran.
The first question is super tough. I kind of program it that way where I give you the first question, the tough question, why the oboe?
Oh, that's an easy one. So I picked the oboe before I actually knew what it sounded like. I was in fourth grade when the school band program, when you were allowed to join the school band program. So our band teacher demonstrated all the instruments, and for the oboe and the French horn, he said, I need kids who are up for a challenge to play these instruments. And so I was like, oh, me, volunteered right away. And he had me start on clarinet because typically oboe players and bassoon players, the double reeds, they have those kids start on a different woodwind instrument just to kind of, get started. Because it's a lot to handle, I think, for beginners. So many variables involved in a double reed. So I started on the clarinet and really liked it, actually. So I played that for 4 years before finally switching to the oboe.
When you get into those band programs as a young musician, a lot of those programs won't even say, for example, the French horn or the oboe.
Yeah.
You'll have a lot of people say, hey, you could pick a flute, clarinet, or a trumpet, for example. But so that was always an interesting thing. So moving on, and maybe you'll get to some things in between when you started and your college. But how does someone get into the Juilliard, the prestigious Juilliard School of Music?
I don't know. You just prepare really well for the audition. It helps, I think, when you're a student auditioning for music schools, if you have some kind of a relationship with the teacher prior to the audition, because, that person, and especially I'm thinking now that I'm on the other side of this, I teach at the University of Washington, that person that you're auditioning for is taking you on, and it's a really big commitment to say, like, you know what, I'm going to guide this person, see them every week, be invested in them beyond that too. I mean, I'm on the phone with my students and emailing them throughout the week. For them to take a chance on a completely unknown person, I think is unlikely unless that person has a really incredibly outstanding audition.
Yeah.
So I think for the students listening to this, my advice is take a lesson with the people you might want to study with sometime.
But does just a lesson do it? Because I feel like I've heard this where a lot of friends, and even I, when I wanted to get into some of those programs, I did take a lesson. But is a lesson enough? Because it seems like 10, 15 other people might do it as well.
Right.
Maybe a couple of lessons.
Well, I think it's a good idea because you also will learn something about the teacher too, like just learn how they teach, how patient they are. You might be somebody who needs a teacher who's really patient because you get stressed out easily or something. Or you might want somebody who's super critical and just like gets right to the point, and that really fires you up. But I think just taking a lesson, it kind of puts you in that person's mind. It's obviously you're not guaranteed to get in if you take a lesson or two, but the audition is also really important.
You've had, you went to grade school where it's very competitive. Now you play with a great orchestra, and you've played with a couple other professional orchestras. How do you find motivation to practice? Because I've heard a lot of students or even professional musicians that say, on this day, I was just not motivated, I couldn't practice. How do you find motivation to, despite any of the obstacles in life, whether it's health or relationships or other things, to find the energy to go into the practice room and say, I'm a professional musician, I have to do this, and I have to practice today? How do you find the motivation on those days?
For me, the motivation is typically not the problem. It's more of like time and energy. I would play music all day if I could.
Really? Okay.
But yeah, you only have so much physical and mental stamina, and you only have so much time. So I think the things that really get me to be consistently prepared is like I want to come into work and do well. Like, I feel a responsibility to the music and also to my colleagues. Like, I need to be there bringing my A game, being totally prepared. I want to be a reliable presence for the other people on stage.
Because playing in an orchestra is, you're part of a team.
Absolutely.
Everyone has to come in with their, absolute best to perform at the high level. Another thing, which I know from the athlete perspective, but also musicians have this, is there a ritual, a thing that you do before a concert? Does Mary Lynch have some special magical formula before the concert?
Well, not so much for orchestra concerts because they happen so frequently that like I don't feel like I have to, I don't know, do some kind of major ritual to get myself centered. I can just kind of get there right away. When I'm playing a concerto, I do have a ritual. So like the most recent solo playing I did was the Strauss concerto like 4 months ago. And so before that, I get up in the morning, I'll play my scales, I'll just try to get myself to a point where everything feels centered in place. I feel in control. Like I want to feel really good on the oboe. I'll spend a half hour to an hour, not that much time, the morning of, and then I just really try to rest throughout the day, and I'm usually quiet. I don't like a lot of stimulation right before a big performance.
So no coffee?
Well, I have coffee every morning, so I still have coffee. But more like just silence, not a lot of conversation. I just kind of like to have time to myself before I do something really big that requires a lot of energy. And then maybe the other slightly strange thing is my pre-concert meal when I'm like doing something that's a little extra stressful than normal is a bowl of oatmeal with peanut butter and a banana and probably a few chocolate chips thrown in. that like gets me ready to play.
You did a couple of recent recordings, or at least definitely one recording with Seattle Symphony. You want to talk about the piece, what it took to have that recording and play at such a high level?
Sure. Man, that thing. So I recorded the Dalbavie oboe concerto, and it's the first recording of the piece. That was the hardest thing I've ever played in my entire life, by quite a significant amount. It took a lot of really deliberate, planned preparation. So I got the music maybe like 6 months before the recording.
Wow.
And I saw it, and I think my heart actually skipped a beat because I don't think I've ever seen so many notes on a page. And like a lot of extended techniques. There were these multiphonics written without any fingerings, so I had to kind of solve that puzzle, figure out how to best, represent the notes that were there. But yeah, so I got the music about 6 months ahead of time, and then I just started trying to play parts of it just to get a general idea of what it sounded like. I was playing it like 3 times as slow as I ultimately played it, but that's sort of how I started preparing, and then I came up with a plan. So like 4 months, maybe a little bit more than 4 months before the recording date, I had, I started charting metronome marks for each section, and the more I got a handle on the different sections of the piece, then I started coming up with a really detailed practice plan. Like I labeled all the parts like 1A, 2A, labeled each section and made sure that within a few days I had covered all the sections of the piece. It was pretty intense, and I spent 3 hours a day on that piece for 3 months solid before the recording.
And is that on top of everything else?
That's on top of everything else. I was working very hard.
Wow, that's and to prepare for a piece like that, because I love chess, I follow a lot of chess and play. Most people don't know maybe that a chess player, especially at the professional level, they actually go out and exercise, a lot of exercise. Not just, they don't just sit there. They actually do a lot of physical activity. Does a musician on your level do also do professional musicians exercise as well?
Oh, yeah, I think that's really important. At least for me, it's certainly important. Like this past year, I started running, and so now I really like it when I can get out in the morning and just run for, I don't know, half hour
Yeah.
or so, and then I feel, everything just kind of feels better that way. You know, playing the oboe, it is exercise in a way. Like, it's a physically demanding activity, so you've got to be physically strong to really do it well.
There are some listeners, including my brother, and I always say this, he's not a classical musician, but he follows this and always listens to the podcast. And a question he might have had is, going to a classical concert, why does the oboe give the A?
That's a good question. A lot of people ask that question. Musicians, too. It's not 100% certain why, but I think the widely accepted theory is that the oboe is kind of the least flexible instrument in the orchestra, and the oboe has a sound that projects pretty easily above all of this textural stuff that happens in the orchestra. So when the oboe gives an A, like, it can kind of cut through, people can latch on to it, even when everyone else is tuning. Yeah, and it's relatively inflexible compared to other instruments in that the instrument itself is pitched at, you know, a certain pitch level. Like, my instrument is pitched at 440, and I make reeds that are pitched to 440 because that's what my orchestra tunes to. So I can't really, like, I can kind of push it up, but even if I'm playing on a reed that I made to play at 440, trying to play it even at 441, 442 gets really difficult, gets physically difficult. Like, I get tired much faster, and the sound quality suffers. It tends to get shallow, pinched. You can kind of hear that I have more lip on the reed as I'm working to bring the pitch up. So I have played in scenarios where I've had to tune at 442, and it is a bit more difficult to make a reed that's higher pitched, but it's manageable as long as I know that ahead of time.
With the reeds, that's another completely
different
aspect. And a simple question, this is not about not a fancy question, but do you ever get in a situation where you have other people, maybe professionals, make reeds for you, or an actual person who, you know, a reed maker make reeds for you, or do you do your own reeds?
I do every step myself.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I think most professional oboists do. I mean, I've heard of some people who maybe they have a hand injury or something and they can't handle a certain step of the reed making process, so they'll get a student to help them or hire somebody to do that for them. But I do everything myself.
If you're sick, how do you play? You know, it's just playing in a symphony orchestra, for those who don't know, is like having any other job. Maybe, you know, you just have to show up to work every week. So how do you show up to work sick?
For an oboe player, it's tough, I think, just because, as I've mentioned, it's a very physically demanding instrument, and you're breathing, you know, you've got to be in good shape cardiovascularly, and so, I mean, I think I have a pretty high tolerance for that. Like, I can tough it out through, I mean, I've toughed it out through some pretty rough stuff and still played. But yeah, there's a limit. Like, if you have a fever and you, like, are dizzy, and, you know, then that's maybe time to call in sick and stay home. But.
Yeah. We speak a lot about music with musicians, especially on this podcast, but it's always interesting to me to hear what professional musicians or young musicians do outside of playing music. Other than running, which you mentioned, is there another hobby, another passion that you have?
Yeah, I love hiking. Like, I just love being in the mountains. And this past summer, actually, I got into mountaineering for the first time.
Wow.
So I summited Mount Rainier a couple months ago.
Wow. That's
which
impressive.
Which is a new thing for me. Yeah.
When did you decide you wanted to be a musician? When was that moment where you were like, I'm just going to go for this and do it?
So first, I thought I wanted to be a composer. I was, like, obsessed with the music of John Williams when I was in middle school. And so in 6th grade, I think, my parents got me a little electronic keyboard, you know, not a full size, just like this little keyboard for Christmas, and so I would sort of plunk around on it and make up things. I'm not a piano player, so I didn't know what I was doing, but I just loved, combining sounds. And then I started really getting into John Williams, and I thought that's what I wanted to do. But then when I was a freshman in high school, in 8th grade, I started playing the oboe. So the following year, I joined my local youth orchestra program, the DC Youth Orchestra. And playing an orchestra for the first time, that just gave me this feeling that I'll never forget. And I remember thinking, I want to do this forever. Yeah. It was just a really special experience.
What age do most oboe players start playing? Because it took you 4 years to get into a great college program. It took you another probably 5 or 6 years to get into a professional orchestra. Is that like natural talent, or you're just a hard worker? I mean, or is it a combination of both? Because it seems like a quick turnaround for someone who just picks up an instrument and 4 years later is accepted to Juilliard.
Oh, well, it took me 6 years to get into Juilliard, or 8 years. Okay. Yes. So I went to Juilliard for my master's degree.
Okay, I see, okay.
The New England Conservatory is where I went for my undergrad.
That's still a great program.
Yes, it was wonderful. Yeah, I mean, it's a combination. Like, there has to be a certain amount of natural ability there. Like, certain kids have a natural apt for intonation and rhythm, and I think that those two things need to come somewhat naturally if you want to really do this. And for me, also, phrasing. Like, I remember when I was a student, I went to take a lesson with Kenny Stillwell, I think was his name, and I'd never taken a lesson from him before, and he commented on that I had such a nice natural phrasing. And I remember I'd never heard that word before.
Wow.
I was like, what do you mean? But I think that's also something that helps. Like, if a student just kind of naturally has a vocal approach to how they play. But yeah, I'm also a really hard worker, so it was definitely my hard work, I think, primarily that got me to where I am. Because when I was in high school, I ended up spending my last 2 years at Interlochen Arts Academy in Michigan. And I had a wonderful teacher there, Dan Stolper. But when I first got there, I was not the best oboe player there, certainly not. But I saw how good everyone else was, and I was like, wow, like, that's so inspiring. I want to be able to do that. And so I practiced like a crazy person, like hours and hours a day for those couple years in particular. And yeah, those practice hours paid off.
Another off-topic question, which is always interesting to me. If you listen to music on your pastime, if you walk out of here and you turn on your phone to listen to music, what would it be? What would you just naturally go to and listen to? Hopefully not even maybe something non-classical, so you could get us excited. Oh,
I'm so boring. I love classical music. Actually, usually when I turn on music, it kind of depends on what I'm doing and what I feel like I need from that music that I'm listening to. So if I'm just like hanging out around the house, baking or cleaning or doing whatever, I have an Aretha Franklin record that I love to blast.
Okay.
And I have a couple of jazz records and some a cappella vocal stuff that's usually the records that I put on. I have a record player. I like Iron and Wine also. I like that group. But what I think I play at least as often as all of those things are Bach cantatas and chorales. Like, I love just sitting down and like closing my eyes and zoning out to Bach.
Oh.
Yeah.
If you were not a musician, what career would you pick or have?
I don't know. That's kind of a tough one because I was pretty single-minded in my pursuit of this career. Mm-hmm. There was one point in high school, like the beginning of my senior year, I was taking an ecology class, which I loved. That was that's my other love in life, is like being outside and everything that comes with that. I love learning about flora and fauna and evolution, and it's just really fascinating to me. So I did have this moment where I was like, oh shoot, like, should I be going for a double major? Like, I love biology and ecology, and maybe I should study that too. And that was actually in the back of my mind for a few years into college. And then I remember I did this one thing. The National Geographic has this thing called a BioBlitz, which happens, I think it happens every year, but in different locations. There was one year it was in DC, early on in my college years. I forget exactly when. But that's when they get, like, just regular people to go out and do a species inventory of a certain area. And it's a 24-hour thing. So, like, I went at 4 a.m. to go look for owls, and I did another bird thing during the day. I did an invertebrates, aquatic invertebrates inventory also, which was fun, but having that really intense, like, packed in ecological experience, I remember walking away from that thinking that was fun. I couldn't do that every day of my life. So I think I picked the right career.
Now, a question that you got, someone emailed me from Mark Lindsay, and he said, I was absolutely blown away by the beauty, skill, and technique you used to flawlessly perform the concerto, which he's speaking about the concerto that we just discussed with the Seattle Symphony. Can you talk about the challenges you faced and how long it took you to practice to get to the level where you could play such a beautiful piece? You made it sound effortless. I guess you answered most of those questions, but anything else you want to share about that concerto?
Yeah, I mean, that was just a lot of really planned out, deliberate practice. And I think the other thing that I've gotten better at over the years is figuring out exactly what I need to do to be prepared and to feel really confident in that, you know, to know that if I do this and if I'm focused and really intentional about what I'm doing, then it's going to be okay.
Yeah.
Like, it's going to be good, and I can trust that.
So it's not just getting into the practice room, it's actually before you even get into the practice room, actually having a plan, which you explained well, how you planned it out over the 6 months and the 4 months and what it took to get there. Another question, if your students invite you to an escape room with them, would you do it?
Oh, I think I know where that's coming from. Probably not until after they graduate.
Another question from the same person, and that's Logan. Logan is an Oboe student, and actually now I should call him a professional because he's
he's doing quite a lot in the area. Yeah. He's done really well for himself.
How has your recent experiences as a professor at the University of Washington affected the way you approach performing?
That's a great question. I think it makes me more thoughtful about exactly what I'm doing when I'm playing. And I think for me, it's really strengthened the connection between, like, the mind-body connection when you're playing, which is so important. Because when I'm teaching, I have to be able to articulate exactly what I'm doing. And yeah, demonstrating is important, but, you know, conductors don't demonstrate exactly how they want something to be played, right? They have to articulate it or show it or sing it, something like that. So I try to mimic my teaching to that. I mean, I will demonstrate for students, but usually when I take out my oboe in lessons, it's because all else has failed.
Interesting. Okay.
So yeah.
One more question, and this is from Ian Schneiderman, who's a bassoonist. What do you do when you are in a reed slump?
Oh, I cry. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, those are the worst. I make more reeds. I don't know. I mean, I try to, like, for me, if I'm in a reed slump, it's usually gouger related or cane related, because it's not like I'm getting worse at making reeds. So I just try to figure out exactly what the root of the problem is and address it, because the only way it's going to be over is if I do something about it. It's not going to magically go away.
What's next for you? Musically, what's next? I mean, maybe something that you're excited. Obviously, you have things happening every week, but something that you're really excited about.
Like a big thing. You know, I've been thinking more and more about recording a solo album, like music for oboe and piano. That's been on my mind for a couple years now. And yeah, it's still on my mind.
So that maybe answers my next question, which is, what's something you would want to do next as a oboe player? Is there a concerto that you haven't done and you really want to do?
The Mozart concerto.
Okay.
I've never performed the Mozart concerto, which I think is a bit unusual
Because
for
you've probably
professional
played-
oboe players. So.
You've probably played it at all of your auditions.
Yeah, I've played it so many times at auditions. I've played it in recital with piano, but never with orchestra. So.
Mary, it was an absolute pleasure. It was great chatting
yeah,
with
you
you.
too.
And it seems like the time always passes so quick when I do these things because I always have people like you who are inspirational and awesome and fun to have a conversation with. Anything that we missed that you want to say before we take off?
No, not that I can think of.
Thank you for being here. Thank you.
Oh, thanks.
Have a beautiful day.
You too.